that is taken from the Bible, taken from the prophets. Well, one day the southern kingdom was conquered. That means they were beat in a battle by Assyria. And then the Assyrians surrounded Jerusalem. The people were afraid, but the Assyrians went away. Now Isaiah's prophecy for Jerusalem said that the kingdom would fall, but that a remnant, a few of the people, would be saved. So the prophet of Isaiah, perhaps it made people think that the Assyrians were the ones who were going to knock down the city, that the kingdom would fall. But it was not the Assyrians, but the Babylonians who took the city, and they did take many people away into exile. So Isaiah's prophecy told them this. Remember in the story of the exile and the return, when the people left Jerusalem and had to travel to Babylon? Do you remember the chain that we used to show how it was separated? I'm still learning to volunteers. You see, I'm making sure I follow it correctly too. It's confusing. Well, remember how we put the chain across to show that they were held back? They were separated? Listen to that. It's like a door closing, like a key locking. So the prophecy of Isaiah traveled into exile. The second prophecy of Isaiah, he had a lot of prophecies, and the second prophecy of Isaiah must have been one of those people who was taken, for he wrote his words in Babylon. So Isaiah's first prophecy was here. You'll remember from our story a couple weeks ago that then he came here. He said that there would be a highway made straight in the desert that they would go home on one day. So he was hopeful. People had lived in Jerusalem. They had been taken over, brought into exile, kept from their home, kept from what they knew. But while there, Isaiah said, "Don't worry. I've heard from God that we will come back, that we will return. There will be a highway made straight in the desert to bring us home." The third prophecy of Isaiah was one of the people who went back to Jerusalem. The people there were not really glad to see him and the others who returned. The city was still broken down, and many of the walls were still black from the fires the Babylonians had set. The Assyrians had fought there, Babylonians had fought there, and it hadn't been made right again. It was still a big mess. So it was a strange thing to come home. Some of the people weren't happy to see them. Some of the people were confused, even though they had come home. The third prophecy of Isaiah helped the people and the priests get ready for a time when they would not have their own king and things would be different. So Isaiah was with them during all the changes, back and forth, back and forth. Now here's the prophecy of Jeremiah. Jeremiah was one of the people who stayed in Jerusalem. He said that the city would fall, but that the people of Jerusalem would not understand what he was talking about. Finally, when the Babylonians came, he and Baruch, his scribe, went to Egypt with some others to be safe. But he was very sad. He was away from his home and his people, Even though they hadn't understood his words, he was sad to be away. We'll leave it here since that was Jeremiah's home, Jerusalem. Now here's the prophecy of Ezekiel. Ezekiel wrote his words in Babylon. So we'll put him here next to Isaiah. He was taken away with one of the first groups out of Jerusalem, even before Jerusalem was totally torn down. He was a prophet in his new home in Babylon. So this is a lot to keep track of, friends. Jerusalem, the city of God, was attacked by Assyria, attacked by Babylon. Many of the people were brought into exile, kept away from their home, and yet God's prophecy was with them. They returned, some of them, not all, and more prophecy, more words from God, more things were shared that God had to say. Well, Ezekiel told the people, Ezekiel told the people in exile that Jerusalem would be destroyed. Remember that? Same story. He was sharing from here, though, that Jerusalem would be destroyed and that they would not go home soon. So he was telling something different. After Jerusalem was destroyed, he had visions of hope that they would go home again, and they would be like dry bones in a valley that put themselves back together again, turned into people and walked to their old home. It's like dry bones, dead, sad, alone for so long, put back together, bone by bone, and the flesh and the muscle and the skin added on till they could be whole again in their old home. Now, these are most of the prophets in the Old Testament. We know a lot about them because their words were written down a long time ago. Today, there are still prophets. They speak to rulers, to priests, to ministers, to pastors, to rabbis, and to the people. Prophets still speak to us, men and women, young people, old people, boys, girls. They still say and do what God wants them to do. And they help us all to know the true way to live and die. Prophets come from all kinds of different places and are all kinds of different people, just like you. So some of you in this circle may become prophets. You may hear words from God. You may hear messages and draw close to God to understand what God wants you to know. Hi. At this point, you would begin the wondering time, and I want to apologize because that was kind of a tricky lesson for me to set up. I gave you a heads up, and yet even still, it was very challenging to make sure that everything ended up in the right place. So all the more reason to be at ease about getting everything in place. As you're sharing the wondering, feel free to read more from the different prophets. We only read just a tiny excerpt, and of course there is so much information, so many questions and understandings that can come from reading these prophets. But we don't have time to read them all in the bulk of the lesson, but invite the children to read them on their own. For the sake of this lesson, and for most of the lessons that we share, the Jesus Storybook Bible is a great resource for talking about the prophets. There's a story specifically about Isaiah called Operation No More Tears, which is a really appropriate way to share the story of what it's like to be a prophet, to share the story of how Isaiah was put in place, was given this special gift so that he could get the world ready for Jesus. So I would read from that. It's page 144, and that's in your lesson. But anyways, yes, thank you for your grace and understanding that, even I have to kind of figure it out. I've done this lesson before, but there are just a lot of moving parts, and so I hope that this video and kind of seeing it laid out visually is helpful, and let me know if you have any questions, since this is kind of a unique one. So, all right, thanks so much.